I want to share something with you that I've been realizing lately and something that I've actually been thinking a lot about. And that's how God often disrupts our comfort. One of the first signs that God is moving us from one season into another season, it's actually discomfort. The things that once satisfied us start to feel empty. Doors that once opened easily start to feel not only closed, but tightly closed. And the brook starts drying up. And if we don't recognize and realize what's happening in that season, we can actually reject that season. And honestly, I think most of us immediately go to oh, I must be under spiritual attack or something must be off. But what if it's God bringing that discomfort over our lives to move us? What if the discomfort isn't demonic resistance? If the brook never dried up, Elijah may have stayed there forever. The brook wasn't evil. Most of you, I know that you know the story that I'm talking about. The brook wasn't evil. It was provision, but it wasn't meant to be a permanent provision. It was meant to be a season. And there are seasons in our lives where God begins to disconnect our emotional attachment to the season that we're actually in. And I think that's difficult for us because we confuse familiar and comfortable with peace, with permanent. And honestly, right now, I've been feeling this for quite a long time. I feel very deeply right now in my own life that God is bringing me into a season where I feel like I need to be hearing God clearly. I can't be relying on emotional attachments. I need to be relying on God's voice and being able to discern the moment and discern the next step by listening to His voice in the season. And I actually recognize this spiritual pattern in my life, and I recognize this restlessness because I felt it before. I've actually felt it many times before. One of the specific times that I felt this restlessness and this discomfort is right before I entered into the mission field. The season that I was in, the life that I was building, it didn't match what God began to stir in my spirit. My life wasn't falling apart. The season wasn't evil. Everything wasn't wrong. It was actually going pretty well if I think back on it. It was just no longer lining up to where God was leading me to. And God will begin to work on us internally. He will begin to prepare us internally before He ever changes what's external. And I think we begin to misunderstand and when we begin to assume that discomfort always means that something is wrong. But the discomfort can actually be proof of God calling us to a higher place, calling us out of what we have settled into the place that's just comfortable and familiar. And He's actually calling us above that and calling us out of that comfortable living to go into our next season. And if we look back on different places in our life, we realize that God begins stretching us right before He moves us. Because if our hearts never change, we will definitely cling to what is familiar forever. And the battle becomes that familiar place that feels safe. Even when you know deep down God is calling you somewhere else. He's calling you to another season. He's calling you to another place in your spiritual walk, in your life. And I realize now that if I had clung to what was familiar, every time God was trying to move me, there would be doors that I would have never walked through. I would have stood at the knocking on the door that was closed, and I would never have walked through that other door simply because I was afraid to leave what felt safe. And that middle place can feel suffocating. And that is when many people come into a place where they feel trapped. Because we're in between. It's that middle place, it's that between place where we're leaving something that we're familiar with. We're leaving something that feels safe to us, that's even something that we thought would be permanent. And we are we're moving into something that we have no idea what's ahead of us. And that can make you feel trapped if you're not careful. It can make you feel suffocated. It can feel suffocating if you're not careful. And the temptation in those moments is to cling tighter to what feels safe. And it's really hard to let go of that emotional attachment, because the danger isn't in the discomfort. The danger is in resisting that clinging feeling that we have in our lives, that we want to stay in that place where we feel safe. The brook often dries up, or the season often begins to feel uncomfortable whenever the assignment is completed. The brook was a blessing for Elijah. God brought him to that place until it was time to go. He obeyed, he moved, and God spoke and brought him into his next assignment. If he had refused to move, the thing that God used to sustain him would have prevented him from going into that next season. Now, if you go back to the story of Elijah, do you remember what that next season was? Do you remember the next assignment? The next assignment was the widow, on the verge of giving up. It was supernatural provision that never ran out until there was rain that came again over the land that was in a season of famine. It never ran out. It was supernatural provision. The next assignment, Elijah's next assignment, was connected to somebody else's breakthrough. It was connected to miracles. If he had stayed emotionally attached to that brook, to that season, to that place where God had brought him to, he would have missed the people that God wanted to connect him to in the next season. And some of the greatest prisons are us staying in seasons that were blessed, but we refuse to move when God tells us to move. That becomes a prison. That blessed season becomes a prison in our lives. Discomfort is that first sign of God preparing us for movement. And we can't cling so tight to what once sustained us that it's causing us to disobey Him in the move. Disobey Him from coming out of one season into another season. So before you ask God to remove your discomfort, ask Him to show you, first of all, through your discomfort, if He is answering that prayer of going to that higher place that you've been praying. Ask Him first of all, before you ask Him to remove the discomfort, before you just assume that it's a spiritual attack, ask God, be discerning, and ask Him if He's maybe answering that prayer that you've been praying. Thank you for watching. Keep seeking and stay ready.